Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with the extraordinary life of a world ruled not by kings or knights, but by rules. Rules so peculiar they seem almost comical today. Yet for those who lived under their weight, these laws were the fragile thread between order and ruin. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. It begins not in a castle or cathedral, but in a hut no larger than a modern living room. The air smells of smoke and straw, the scent of sheep's wool and damp earth pressed into the walls. A single fire glows in a pit at the centre, its light flickering across faces weary from labour. Outside, the bell from the church tower tolls in slow, deliberate strokes. It's more than a sound, it's commandment. At the third peal, every villager knows what must follow. Fires are to be covered, candles snuffed, doors barred. The day has ended by decree, and night belongs to obedience. The law was called curfew from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire. In theory, it was a safety rule. In practice, it was a leash. The medieval town was a tinderbox of wood, thatch and chance. A single coal escaping the hearth could roll across a floorboard, touch a rush mat, and by dawn, the entire village would be a pyre. The rule had reason then. Each sound of that bell was a survival ritual. Still, for those huddled in the dark, it felt like punishment. Imagine a family in the 13th century. Father, mother, 2 children, and a grandmother whose joints ache like the timbers above her. They sit in silence as the last embers hiss beneath an iron pot. The only light left comes from the thin seam of moonlight slipping between shutters. It is forbidden to keep the flame alive, yet no one sleeps. They listen to mice in the walls, to a dog barking somewhere beyond the ditch, to the faint laughter of men who have ignored the order. Somewhere, a night watchman's staff strikes the cobblestones, and the sound of his voice, "All's well," floats through the cold. This was no bedtime peace. The dark was a living thing. It hid thieves, wolves, ghosts, and worse, the unknown. The curfew bell was meant to protect, but it also made every night feel like an exile. The wealthy, of course, slept differently. In manors and stone halls, lords kept their fires burning under the care of servants. Flames glowed behind leaded glass, spilling warmth into rooms hung with tapestries. For them, night was a luxury. For peasants, it was a sentence. And yet, curfew wasn't merely superstition. The towns of Europe had burned again and again. London in 1135, Chartres in 1134, Lubeck in 1157. Whole neighbourhoods vanished in hours. Charred beams, melted bells, and ash where bread ovens once stood, reminders carved into memory. So, when the bell rang, people obeyed, not out of loyalty but out of fear. Every spark was treason against survival. After the fire is smothered, the hut falls quiet. The family lies down on straw mattresses, thin blankets pulled to their chins. The air grows colder, the smell of smoke fading to the musk of wool and breath. Outside, frost begins to lace the windows. A child whispers a prayer against nightmares. The mother listens to the slow creak of the rafters, counting heartbeats until sleep comes. Somewhere, she wonders whether the Lord's Hall still burns brightly, and if God counts light as sin. Rules like these shaped medieval rhythm. There was no clock, no electricity, no convenient rebellion. The bell was time itself. It told people when to work, when to pray, when to stop. Freedom was a concept for poets and nobles. The rest lived by the sound of metal, echoing across valleys. Those who broke curfew could face fines or humiliation, sometimes even imprisonment, though more often the shame of being dragged before the bailiff. And yet, in every town, there were those who risked it. Bakers who needed to knead dough for morning bread. Blacksmiths who worked by hidden embers. Lovers who whispered past midnight under the stars. Small rebellions smouldered where the law could not reach. Still, the rule had poetry in it. The idea that the town itself could breathe in unison. All fires dimmed, all hearts slowed, all fears waiting out the same darkness. The bell didn't just control, it connected. It reminded each soul that they were part of something larger, a fragile city of wood and faith holding its breath till dawn. When morning came, another bell reversed the order. The matins call broke the silence. summoning life back into motion. Fires were rekindled from saved embers, water fetched, bread baked, and the day began again. For centuries, this cycle defined existence. Fire and silence, work and rest, obedience and survival. The curfew bell was the first of many laws that turned ordinary acts, sleeping, eating, dressing, praying into acts of state and salvation. It is easy now to mock such rules, to imagine medieval people as fearful or naive. But within those walls of thatch and smoke, order meant life. Each law was a thread woven into the fabric of survival, tying one family's safety to another's discipline. The man who covered his fire wasn't bowing to tyranny. He was protecting his neighbour. The woman who whispered her prayer in the dark wasn't surrendering to fear. She was participating in the first fragile form of public safety the world had ever known. So when you picture that bell swinging in its tower, its rope frayed, its clapper worn smooth by centuries, remember that it tolled for more than obedience. It tolled for hope, for the wish that tomorrow might dawn over the same roofs, still standing, still whole. In its echo lived the sound of an entire civilization, learning, through trial and smoke, how to survive itself. And when you hear bells today, church chimes, school hours, alarms marking the end of shift, know that their rhythm was born in that same darkness. A memory of the nights when silence could burn, and order was the only light left. Morning light spills into the village, soft and pale, as if uncertain it has permission to enter. Smoke rises from hearths uncovered at last, curling into the chill air. In the square, a line of merchants unfolds their stalls, wool and linen stacked in faded piles. To most, these colours, mud brown, soot grey, dull green, are not a matter of taste. They are law. You stand among them, a peasant by decree. The itch of your tunic reminds you of your place before you even take a breath. Scratchy wool, unlined, unadorned because you must not appear finer than you are. In the Middle Ages, the fabric on your skin was as political as the seal on a royal document. To wear the wrong cloth was to trespass against the very architecture of society. Sumptuary laws, they called them, from the Latin sumptus expense. These were the rules that dictated what a person could own, eat, or wear, depending entirely on their social rank. They were not born from vanity, but from terror, the terror that the boundaries between classes might blur. Imagine, for a moment, a marketplace in the 14th century. The street hums with barter and gossip. A merchant's daughter passes by in a gown, just a shade too vivid, dyed in cochineal imported from distant lands. Heads turn. A constable notices. Within a day, she is summoned to the Guildhall to explain herself. The fine she pays could feed her family for months. But the real punishment is humiliation. To be made visible as a pretender, her silk confiscated, her reputation stained. Why such obsession with clothing? Because appearance was identity. A noble's worth was measured not only in acres and titles, but in how much his garments gleamed. Velvet, satin, silk, brocade, each thread a declaration that the world's wealth passed through his hands. If a peasant could mimic that sheen, even for a moment, the whole order trembled. How would the servant know whom to bow to? How would the priest know whose sins to forgive first? So the laws grew specific, almost absurdly so. In England, the statutes of apparel dictated that only earls and above could wear cloth of gold or purple silk. Knights were permitted silver embroidery, but no jewels. Merchants of means could wear fine wool, but only if it was home-dyed, never imported. Even shoe design became a battleground. The rich flaunted their status with poulaines, those long, needle-pointed shoes that curled upward like the beaks of exotic birds. The longer the tip, the higher the rank. Some reached lengths that had to be tied to the knee with ribbons. You, a farmer or craftsman, were forbidden from such extravagance. Your shoes were to be plain, sturdy, shaped like honest feet. It may sound petty, but the stakes were immense. The visual order of society was everything. To blur it was to invite chaos. When everyone dressed like nobles, who would fight, till, serve, or obey? A noble mistaken for a miller was an insult to the divine hierarchy itself. Because medieval Europe didn't just believe in class, it believed that God had arranged it. The bright fabrics of the rich were, in their eyes, proof of heavenly favour. The rough garments of peasants were signs of humility and divine purpose. In France, a merchant who wore ermine could be fined, stripped, or worse. In Florence, inspectors walked the streets. Their job to spot illegal luxury, the length of sleeves, the width of belts, the glitter of rings. Chroniclers note cases where women were forced to remove pearls in public, or men ordered to cut their cloaks shorter on the spot. There were exceptions, of course, for celebration or mourning, but even those required permission. A wedding could grant a day of finery, then back to coarse wool and obedience. And yet, beneath the enforcement lay fascination. The poor admired the rich precisely because they glittered. In taverns and hearths, people whispered about the fashions of lords and ladies. They carved them into woodcuts, painted them into church murals as cautionary figures. Lust, vanity, pride. But they also copied them in secret. A servant might sew a hidden trim of silk inside her sleeve where no one could see. A cobbler might carve an extra inch into a shoe just for pride. These were the quiet rebellions, small defiances that made life feel momentarily one's own. The symbolism of colour was its own language. Blue was faith and loyalty. Red was power and sin. Green fertility. Black humility or mourning, depending on who wore it. Purple, however, was sacred. It came from the murex snail, its dye worth more than gold. To wear purple without the right bloodline was not just vanity, it was blasphemy against order itself. In royal courts, garments became performances. Chronicles describe banquets where nobles paraded in layers so heavy with gold thread that servants carried their trains like relics. Meanwhile, peasants walked barefoot past, their entire year's labour barely enough to buy a single yard of the cloth they were forbidden to touch. It was not that the poor were blind to injustice. They simply believed it eternal. To them, these laws were part of the weather of existence, unfair, immutable, but familiar. Still, envy had a scent, and the church could smell it. Preachers thundered from pulpits that vanity was sin, that the humble robe was the surest path to heaven. But even bishops wore crimson robes and jewelled rings, their fingers gleaming with divine irony. The people noticed. They always noticed. One can almost feel the frustration simmering in those smoky cottages, the desire to look beautiful without permission, to escape the drabness that marked a lifetime of toil. The law turned even beauty into rebellion. A ribbon too bright, a hem too fine, and you became a criminal. Yet the strangest thing is how the rules worked. They lasted for centuries, shaping wardrobes across kingdoms and generations. They defined who belonged where, how wealth looked, and even how aspiration smelled of wool, grease, or rose oil, depending on your place. As evening approaches again, you hang your cloak plain, brown, safe, and step outside. The sun dips low, washing the rooftops in gold. Somewhere, a noble rides past, his cloak billowing in scarlet. For a heartbeat, you feel envy so sharp it burns. Then you remember the fines, the shame, the dungeon stories whispered at market. You look away. The order holds. In that brief moment between light and dusk, the world seems almost reasonable. Everyone wearing what they're supposed to, playing the parts assigned. But beneath the surface, something trembles the longing to be seen, not for rank or rule, but for the human within the cloth. That desire, quiet as a heartbeat, will one day unravel the seams of feudal Europe. For now, though, the needle stays still, and the law decides what you may look like. In every medieval town, clothing wasn't just cloth, it was choreography, a dance of colour, weight, and texture that told the story of who you were, and more importantly, who you were not. The way a sleeve draped, the sound of a hem against cobblestone, even the shimmer of a cuff when the sun caught it all whispered of rank and destiny. To a noblewoman, the rustle of silk was a kind of music. To a peasant, it was a forbidden sound. Those who lived by the plough could feel the boundary in their fingertips, the rough scrape of wool that marked them as common. But beneath that coarse fabric beat the same heart that dreamed of beauty. It is one of history's quieter tragedies, how even the yearning to look graceful was punished as arrogance. Imagine a small town near the edge of France in the late 1200s. The market is alive with scent-dried fish, hay, and the faint sweetness of fermenting cider. At its edge stands a weaver's stall, the air thick with floating threads. A young woman named Elaine pauses, fingers tracing a length of blue cloth. It is finer than anything she's ever owned, dyed with woad imported from distant traders. Her breath catches. Blue is for loyalty, they say, the colour of devotion. She thinks of wearing it to church, of the way her friends might gasp, but she knows she cannot. Blue, at this depth of hue, is restricted to women of noble birth. To buy it would be a kind of crime, a visible one. Still, Elaine hesitates. The merchant lowers his voice. "It's just a remnant," he whispers, "a scrap too small for notice." He wraps it in paper and slides it across the stall. A secret transaction, a sin folded in cloth. Later, when she sews it into the lining of her sleeve, no one will see it but her. A private rebellion, one soft thread beneath 1,000 rules. Every medieval town had stories like hers. There were tailors who bent the laws, merchants who smuggled forbidden dyes, and inspectors who accepted a coin to look the other way. But there were also those who enforced with zeal, men known as wardens of apparel, appointed by the crown or council. They prowled streets during festivals, peering at cloaks and hoods, measuring embroidery with their eyes. Sometimes they carried knives to snip illegal trims from garments right in the square. Shame was their tool, spectacle their weapon, and shame worked. In a world where community meant survival, being mocked in public could feel worse than a fine. A man accused of dressing above his station might be paraded through town in rags, forced to confess vanity as though it were a mortal sin. The same people who envied him in secret would jeer loudly, proving their own loyalty to the order that kept them small. The obsession ran deeper than vanity, it was about fear. A noble's authority depended on visibility. His wealth was fragile, built on perception. If a merchant could imitate his appearance, could shimmer in the same velvet, then what separated them? Power blurred with fabric. And so the ruling class legislated not only who could rule, but who could shine. In monasteries, even holy men debated the morality of dress. Some preachers thundered that God himself had woven hierarchy into the fabric of creation, gold thread for kings, coarse wool for labourers. To defy it was to unpick his design. But others whispered dissent, that Christ had worn the same plain robe as fishermen, that beauty should not be chained to birth. Those whispers, faint as they were, would echo centuries later in revolutions of thought and class. In castles, meanwhile, the rich made fashion into theatre. Imagine a feast in the court of Burgundy, torchlight blazing, banners fluttering, the scent of spiced wine in the air. Nobles glide across tiled floors in garments heavy with embroidery, their sleeves trailing like banners of conquest. A duchess enters wearing crimson velvet so thick it drags behind her, embroidered with silver hawks in flight. Servants lift the train as if it were a relic. Across the hall, a poet scribbles on parchment, comparing her gown to dawn upon a battlefield. But not everyone in the room is invited to shine. Near the wall, servants watch in silence, their own woolen tunics patched and dull. They stand so still that candlelight slides past them without catching. They are ghosts among colour. For them, beauty is proximity, to hold the fabric, to press it flat, to brush it clean. A servant polishing a noble's fur collar might pause for half a heartbeat, feeling the softness under his fingers, wondering how such a texture could exist in the same world as hunger. Then he looks down, remembers himself, and goes on. Sumptuary laws were meant to protect order, but they also revealed longing, the longing of human beings to be seen, admired, or simply to escape drabness. A bright sleeve could feel like a small resurrection. A fur trim could warm not only the body, but the dream of being more than one station allowed. That was the real threat. Not vanity, but imagination. Over time, the rules grew stranger. In England, even servants' wages were dictated alongside what they could wear. A maid might be fined for pearls, a butcher for silver buckles. Tailors had to memorize the law before they could cut cloth. In some regions, women were banned from veils of a certain transparency, lest they seem too noble or too tempting. Law tried to police even desire. And yet, law could not stitch the human heart shut. People found ways to express beauty where rules had no reach. In embroidery hidden on inner hems, in carved belt buckles passed in secret as gifts. In weddings where, for one night, the poorest woman might borrow a noble hue and walk beneath garlands as if she belonged among angels. By candlelight, Elaine finishes her gown. The forbidden blue thread gleams faintly in the lining, invisible to anyone but her. Tomorrow, she'll wear it to market, not to flaunt, not to defy, but to remember that she is more than her station. She will stand beside women in brown and grey and feel the secret brush of colour against her wrist like a heartbeat. For centuries, people like her kept tiny rebellions alive, stitched between seams and sealed with silence. The laws changed, but the impulse did not. To dress is to dream. To adorn oneself is to whisper, "I exist beyond my assigned name." And so, Even in a world ruled by thread and fear, beauty survived, small, stubborn, shining beneath the wool. Evening again. The sun slides down behind the timber roofs, and with it, the whole village exhales a slow, weary surrender to the dark. Chickens are herded into coops. The last smoke of the day rises pale and lazy, drifting through rafters and into the open sky. You might think the night belonged to rest, but in the Middle Ages, even sleep was regulated. From the bell tower above the churchyard, a single note rolls across the rooftops, then another, then a third. Couvre-feu, cover your fire. The rule is not advice, but law. Inside a cottage, a woman bends over her hearth. She drags a flat iron lid across the glowing embers, the metal hissing as it meets heat. Her husband sprinkles a handful of ash on top, sealing the flame under a small grey tomb. The room cools instantly, shadows gathering in the corners. They whisper their evening prayers quickly before the light is gone. To us, the ritual might seem quaint, but to them, it was survival. Every house in the village was built of tinder thatch, timber, straw mats for flooring, even dried dung mixed into walls for insulation. One stray spark could leap from a chimney, dance on the wind, and by morning the town would be a memory. Fires were both salvation and threat, and the curfew bell was meant to tame them. The danger was no exaggeration. Chronicles tell of entire towns devoured by flames. London burned in 1135, Bruges in 1245, Lübeck in 1157. In Paris, a royal decree ordered every citizen to extinguish their fire after the evening bell, punishable by fine or imprisonment. It was the medieval version of a fire code, enforced not by inspectors but by fear. Picture the silence that followed. Hundreds of homes dark at once, each family holding its breath as the final sparks dimmed, the world shrinking to the shape of a single room. For the poor, it was obedience under duress. For the powerful, it was suggestion. Nobles in their stone manors kept flames alive in braziers guarded by servants. Even in law, class decided comfort. But there were practical truths buried in the rule. Fire was expensive, charcoal was precious, wood scarce. By covering the embers, instead of extinguishing them completely, families could preserve a core of heat to rekindle at dawn. It was a small economy of survival. One coal saved was one less trip into the forest, one less back bent under the weight of gathered logs. Outside, the curfew bell fades. A night watchman makes his rounds, lantern swaying. All's well, he calls, though it is not always true. Somewhere in the outskirts, a baker keeps his oven warm. Despite the prohibition, dough must rise for dawn, and the law is no friend to bread. He works fast, hoping no one will notice the faint glow under his door. Another house ignores the rule altogether. A midwife kneels beside a labouring woman, the fire kept low but alive. Birth waits for no curfew. In such moments, life itself becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Still, fear was ever present. The faintest hint of smoke at night could bring suspicion. Neighbours would rush to smother flames, shouting warnings or curses. Town criers sometimes patrolled with buckets, and if a blaze broke out, bells reversed their meaning, no longer peace, but alarm. Fire! They would ring, and the entire village would pour into the streets, half-dressed, forming frantic chains to pass water from wells. The couvre-feu shaped the very rhythm of existence. At dusk, the world divided neatly, light for labour, dark for obedience. The bell was timekeeper, warden, and mother all at once. Children learned early to hush when it rang. Lovers stole their meetings before it did, and travellers caught outside the walls when the curfew fell were often forced to sleep in ditches, barred from entry until dawn. Yet within that darkness, other lives unfolded. Poets spoke of honest night, the hour when work ceased and thought began. In the hush that followed the bell, people told stories, prayed, or whispered dreams. The silence that fear created also became a space for imagination. Even the law could not extinguish that. In wealthier towns, curfew evolved into ritual. Bells marked not just fire's end, but the civic heartbeat, closing of markets, locking of gates, start of vespers. In London, 9 strokes signalled the hour, a tradition that echoed long after the danger passed. Modern clocks would later mimic that rhythm, mechanical bells replacing bronze ones. The habit of measuring life by sound, it began here, in those anxious twilights. Some chroniclers, centuries later, remembered the rule with affection. They spoke of a simpler order, a world that knew when to stop. But others saw the darkness differently, as control disguised as safety. The curfew, they said, kept not only fires in check, but people. To forbid light was to forbid gathering, gossip, rebellion. The same rule that saved towns from burning also made sure no secret meetings smouldered after dusk. And yet, perhaps both were true. Law and mercy intertwined. Like the twin flames, the villagers buried each night dangerous, necessary, inseparable. As midnight settles, the streets grow still. The moon glints on shutter hinges, on the frozen lip of a water bucket. The village has become a shadow of itself, safe, silent, waiting. A single ember glows faintly beneath the iron lid of a hearth, a heartbeat under ash. By dawn it will flare again, red and alive, proof that survival has outlasted fear one more night. In the Middle Ages, time did not live in clocks. It lived in sound. To wake, to work, to pray, to rest, every act began and ended with a bell. Imagine a morning when the air is still misted with cold. The church tower stands above the rooftops, its dark silhouette breaking the grey. Then a single toll rolls outward, swelling through alleys and over fields. The sound is not measured in seconds, but in heartbeats. To those who hear it, it is command. It means prime, the first prayer of the day. A peasant rises, stiff and slow, pulling on boots still damp from yesterday's labour. His wife stirs the ashes of the hearth, coaxing life from yesterday's embers. Children rub sleep from their eyes as the bell calls again. Not one family owns a clock, but they all know what hour it is, because the sound tells them who they are supposed to be. Time in the medieval world was not a private possession. It was a public rhythm. The bells dictated it. Matins before dawn, lords at sunrise, prime for the start of labour, tercy mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at twilight, and compline when darkness fell. Monks had devised the order for prayer, but it governed entire towns. Farmers ploughed when they heard sext. Bakers timed their loaves to vespers. Even lovers measured their secret meetings by how many chimes they could steal before the next call. The body learned to obey. Hunger came when the noon bell struck. Weariness deepened when vespers echoed through the air. Without realizing it, people synchronized their muscles to metal. The bell was a heartbeat outside the flesh, steady and unrelenting. In a small monastery overlooking a river valley, a novice monk tends the ropes. His hands are blistered from pulling them day after day, each toll rippling out across farms and cottages. He cannot read the sky's colour for time, only the echo against the water tells him how far the sound has travelled. When he sleeps, he dreams of ringing, of ropes coiling like serpents in the dark. Even in his rest, the bell owns him. In cities, bells multiplied. Cathedrals, guild halls, universities, all claimed their right to mark the hours. To live near one was to inhabit a storm of sound. Chroniclers in 14th century Paris complained that bells rang so often, a man could not keep his thoughts straight, yet people depended on them utterly. Without bells, there was chaos. Merchants would open stalls too soon. Apprentices would miss curfew, and no one could tell where the day began or ended. There was no such thing as being fashionably late. You were either there when the bell said to be, or you were suspect. Oversleeping was moral failure. Missing church was not only sin, but defiance of order. Time belonged to the community, not the individual. And yet, there was beauty in this shared captivity. The bells stitched lives together, across fields, across rivers, across the walls of monasteries and markets. Everyone heard the same sound. It reminded them that they were part of something larger than themselves, a kingdom of rhythm, an empire of echoes. But not all bells spoke of peace. When fire broke out, when invasion threatened, when plague crept near, bells changed their language. They rang faster, harder, as if gasping. People called them the tongues of angels, because they could shout warnings no man could run fast enough to spread. At such times, bells summoned not prayer, but panic. Mothers snatched children. Men ran for buckets or weapons. The same voice that once told them to eat or pray could now order them to flee. The irony was cruel. Those same towers that disciplined the hours could also mark endings. A funeral bell tolled slow and low, the sound spreading like a bruise through the air. In some villages, people paused mid-plough to cross themselves each time it sounded. The toll was thought to drive away demons, to remind the living of mortality. Every bell, a chronicler wrote, is a sermon cast in bronze. For peasants, The rhythm was absolute. They rose before light, worked until the bell said stop, ate when it said eat, and slept when it said sleep. The church measured not just time but virtue. Idleness between bells was sin. A man who worked through the hours of prayer might be warned for pride, believing his labour more urgent than God's rhythm. A woman who failed to stop her spinning at Compline risked gossip for worldliness. The law of hours was invisible, but no less binding than the king's seal. Still, in the quiet between bells, something human persisted. A mother might pause to hush her child after sext, feeling the lull in the day's heat. A ploughman might glance at the horizon and guess the next call before it came, sensing it in his bones. There was wisdom in that, an intimacy with rhythm that no clock would ever give. When mechanical clocks finally arrived in the 14th century, great brass contraptions clattering with gears and weights, people did not trust them. Too exact, they said. Too cold. The bell had warmth, a soul, a living sound. But the gears kept ticking, and soon time itself shifted from belonging to God to belonging to merchants, traders, workers. The day became a commodity, carved into hours, sold for wages. Yet even now, if you listen at dawn or dusk, you may hear echoes of that older order. Church bells still call across valleys, unchanged for centuries. They no longer command obedience, but they still measure belonging. They remind us that time was once a shared breath, not a private countdown. In the Middle Ages, a person didn't keep time. Time kept them. It cradled, corrected, and confined them like a vast invisible hand. And though they lived inside its grip, many found comfort there because in a world ruled by plague, famine, and fear, at least the bell was constant. It sang the same melody every day: rise, work, pray, rest. In its rhythm, they found something that even kings could not control. In a medieval kitchen, hunger had a calendar. It did not strike at random. It was scheduled, sanctified, and supervised by God. The bell that ruled the hours also ruled the appetite. For most of the year, what you ate and when you ate were matters of law, not taste. To live in Christendom was to live inside a system of edible obedience. The church called them fasting days, times when meat vanished from tables and temptation simmered in silence. Fridays, of course, were sacred. On that day, the faithful abstained from flesh in memory of Christ's crucifixion. But it didn't end there. Lent arrived each spring like a long shadow, 40 days of denial that reached into every pot and pantry. Advent before Christmas was another season of restraint. Add to these the vigils of saints, ember days, and the dozens of minor fasts scattered across the year, and nearly a third of a person's life was spent under dietary decree. It was not hunger for its own sake. The church preached that fasting cleansed the soul, burned sin from the body, and disciplined the will. Through the empty stomach, said one monk, the heart becomes full of grace. Yet for peasants who already knew scarcity, grace could taste a lot like plain bread. Picture a small village in March. Winter's stores are low. Barley meal and dried peas fill the bins. The last of the salted pork hangs like parchment in the rafters. But now Lent has come, and meat is forbidden. The family eats boiled leeks, a thin gruel, perhaps a bit of smoked fish if they are lucky. Butter and eggs are off limits too, replaced by oil pressed from nuts or imported olives, if such luxuries can even be found this far from the sea. In monasteries, the rules are stricter still. No flesh passes the lips of monks, except for the gravely ill. The kitchen smells of onions and broth. The sound of chewing is a kind of prayer. One chronicler tells of a monk caught slipping a sliver of bacon into his soup. His punishment was to eat on his knees before the others, tears and grease mixing on his face. But outside the cloister, the lines blur. The rich have their loopholes. Nobles dine on fish pies stuffed with lamprey or eel, creatures technically not meat. In coastal towns, the demand for fish grows so immense that new economies form around it. Rivers are drained of life. Entire villages become fisheries. The Pope himself once declared beavers and puffins as fish for the purpose of fasting creatures that lived in water, therefore fair game for holy hunger. Faith, it seemed, could be flexible when appetites demanded. For common folk, the fast became more punishment than piety. The rules said no flesh, but the stomach argued otherwise. People found quiet ways to bend the law. Broth accidentally boiled with a bone. Sausage hidden under lentils. A feast at dusk when no one could see. Confession booths filled with murmured apologies that smelled faintly of smoke and lard. And yet, there was beauty in the discipline. Fasting created rhythm. a breath between excesses. It made the rare moments of plenty taste like revelation. When Lent ended and the first meat was roasted again, people wept with joy. The flavour of fat on the tongue was like sunlight breaking after storm. Children laughed, elders blessed the feast, and for one night the world felt forgiven. The calendar of hunger also held practical wisdom. By forbidding meat during lean months, the church unknowingly preserved herds, allowing animals to breed and recover. Fishing seasons spread protein more evenly through the year. It was moral regulation, yes, but also medieval ecology, faith as population management. Still, hunger had politics. In towns, markets flourished selling fasting foods, salted herring, almonds, imported oils. Merchants grew rich on piety. Monasteries near rivers became powerful through fish ponds, vast artificial lakes where monks bred carp by the thousands. The line between holiness and commerce blurred until even the saints seemed to swim in profit. The fasting law reached even the smallest acts. Cooks had to know which fats were allowed on which days. Bakers changed recipes. Children were taught to cross themselves before tasting anything rich, as though pleasure itself required permission. Some priests reminded their flocks that even laughter should be quieter during fasts. Joy, too, was rationed. Yet hunger also revealed the tenderness of community. When food ran short, villages shared what little they had. A widow might receive a bowl of peas left on her doorstep. A monk might smuggle bread to a starving child and call it charity, not sin. Fasting turned survival into solidarity. In the castle halls, however, temptation glittered. Chronicles describe nobles sneaking roast meat beneath their cloaks, perfuming rooms with spices to mask the scent. One lord in Burgundy was caught dining on venison during Lent and ordered to donate a year's income to the poor, a punishment that likely cost him less than the feast itself. But for the poor, every day felt like Lent. Hunger did not need a church calendar to arrive. The real cruelty was that the rule punished those who already had nothing to spare. When the bell rang to announce the fast, a peasant might whisper bitterly, "What difference? My stomach has been holy all winter." Still, they obeyed, because to defy the fast was to defy the order of heaven itself. Because somewhere, deep inside the ritual, there was dignity. The same dignity that made people kneel before altars, light candles for lost souls, and trust that discipline meant meaning. And so they waited for Easter, the season of colour after grey, when eggs once banned returned to tables, boiled and dyed and gleaming, when meat returned to pots and bells rang with the joy of resurrection. For one brief week, even the poorest could taste what paradise might be: warmth, fullness, and the lifting of rules. But soon enough, the calendar turned again. Another saint's day approached, another fast, another quiet surrender of flesh. The rhythm resumed, like breath. The world inhaled hunger and exhaled obedience. And beneath it all, people learned that appetite could be prayer, that even deprivation, properly timed, could feed the soul. If fasting divided the year, class divided the plate. To eat in the Middle Ages was to perform one's rank, not through words, but through crumbs. Picture two tables on the same winter evening. In the manor hall, firelight glows against tapestries. Gold dishes gleam beneath chandeliers of wax. At one end sits the lord, surrounded by steaming platters of roasted goose, venison, and spiced wine. The scent of cinnamon and clove fills the air, drifting upward like prayer. Music hums from a corner where a lute is played softly, a rhythm of privilege and plenty. Far below, in the village, another meal takes place the same hour, the same hunger. A family huddles beside their hearth. Their bread is coarse, dark, made from rye or barley. The soup is a thin blend of cabbage, onion, and yesterday's leftovers. They eat in silence, the only music the crackle of wood and the wind pressing against the shutters. Between those two tables lies the real map of the medieval world. Food was not simply nourishment, it was proof of belonging. The higher your station, the whiter your bread. Wheat, rare and costly, was milled fine for nobles. The darker flours were left to the poor. A single loaf could betray your social position. In some towns, bakers were forbidden to sell lord's bread to peasants, and those who tried risked punishment for counterfeiting luxury. The rules extended to every ingredient. Spices, black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg were more than flavour, they were status itself. A nobleman's pantry was a map of trade routes, filled with treasures that had crossed oceans. To sprinkle pepper on a meal was to announce that one's wealth could reach as far as India. To taste saffron was to taste empire. For commoners, such flavors were legend. Most lived in a world of salt, vinegar, and herbs from the yard. If they used spice at all, it was wild mustard or garlic, sharp and humble. A peasant's stew might smell hearty but never exotic. The difference was more than culinary, it was cosmic. To the medieval mind, the order of food reflected the order of heaven. God himself, they believed, had assigned each soul a place in the great feast of existence. Nobles were thought to have hot and dry temperaments, requiring delicate, cooling foods like white bread, capons, and sweet wines. Peasants, with their cold and wet bodies, were meant for earthy meals. Root vegetables, oats, beer, even digestion was classed. Physicians of the time warned that peasants who dared eat noble fare might fall ill, as if their bodies were not built for luxury. The hierarchy went down to the stomach. At banquets, this order became theatre. Guests were seated by rank, served by age, and watched by everyone. Servants carried silver trays while the lord sat on a raised dais, the literal high table. Meat came carved into intricate shapes. Castles, ships, saints. Feasts were less about eating than about displaying control. Each dish said, "I command a world so abundant I can play with it." Meanwhile, in the villages, meat was a festival memory. A family might taste pork at Christmas or a goose at Michaelmas, then not again for months. Cheese, beans and bread kept them alive. In bad years, even that failed, and famine turned rules into ashes. Chronicles speak of times when people ground acorns into flour, boiled grass, or traded their last tools for a handful of meal. And yet, the poor still mimicked the rich in small, defiant ways. A peasant might bake a pie on a saint's day, stuffing it with leeks and eggs and calling it meat. A craftsman might save enough for a splash of imported wine at his daughter's wedding. Even imitation was hope, a belief that joy could be borrowed from those above. In towns, the line between classes blurred dangerously. Prosperous merchants dined like lesser nobles, their tables bright with pewter plates and imported oils. This made rulers nervous. When the rising middle class began to eat too well, authorities responded with laws to separate them once more. Some cities banned certain meats from being sold outside noble households. Others fixed prices to keep luxuries unreachable. Food became a weapon of stability. There were moments, though, when the walls cracked. Fairs and festivals upended the order. During Carnival, butchers roasted oxen in the streets, and even beggars were welcome to eat. For a few days each year, the hierarchy loosened. The poor could taste forbidden sweetness, if only to remember it again in dreams. Religion tried to moralize the hunger. Priests warned that gluttony was sin, that too much spice inflamed the soul. But they also blessed noble tables, thanking God for abundance. In sermons, they called the poor closer to Christ for eating little, yet they never suggested the rich share more than scraps. Heaven, it seemed, was equal only after death. Still, food carried secret meanings of mercy. A loaf left on a church step could feed a stranger. A shared pot could make a community. Hunger taught humility. Hunger also taught kindness. The very same stew that tasted of poverty could also taste of care. In one forgotten chronicle from Flanders, a monk wrote of a baker who defied the law and sold fine white bread to the poor during a harsh winter. He was fined and stripped of his license, but the people called him Saint of the Crust. His loaves became legend. Even now, historians debate if he existed, or if he was simply the embodiment of what people wished kindness looked like. By the 15th century, the invisible menu had hardened into custom. Nobles ate colour, peasants ate shadow, but the longing between them never disappeared. It lived in the scent of roasting meat drifting from castle windows, in the way a farmer might close his eyes and imagine its taste while chewing cabbage. And that longing was powerful, because when people began to question the world itself, why some feasted while others starved, it was not sermons or swords that planted the first doubt. It was hunger, the quiet kind, the kind that makes a person look at the sky and ask whether God truly meant one man's stomach to be full, while another's remained empty. In the clatter of dishes and the silence of empty bowls, the truth hummed softly beneath it all. Rules could dictate who wore silk, who prayed when, who covered the fire at night, but they could not erase appetite. Appetite was eternal, rebellious, and equal. The poor and the noble shared at least this: the ache for warmth, for fullness, for the small mercy of a meal that did not need permission. The medieval forest was not freedom, it was ownership. To modernize, a forest might look wild, an endless weave of oak, ash, and beech. But in the Middle Ages, every tree had a master. Every path, every stream, every bird's nest belonged to someone, and most of the time, that someone was not you. For peasants, the woods were both lifeline and trap. They needed it for everything: firewood, berries, honey, herbs, and game. Yet stepping beneath its branches could mean stepping into crime. Forest law, one of the strangest and most feared inventions of medieval rule, turned nature itself into property. The word forest didn't originally mean woodland. It meant land set aside for the king's pleasure for hunting, hawking, and proving his dominance over all creation. It could include fields, villages, even entire towns. The forest of England at its height covered nearly a third of the realm, from the oaks of Sherwood to the heather of Hampshire. The rule was simple and cruel. What grew or lived there was the king's. The deer, the boar, the hawk, the trout, all sacred possessions of the crown. To kill one without permission was not theft, it was treason. Picture a villager named Godric, his family hungry, the winter long. He slips into the royal forest before dawn, breath hanging white in the air. His bow is worn smooth from years of secret use. He moves silently, his boots wrapped in rags to muffle the snow. Every step is a prayer not to be caught. He knows the penalties. First, offence, fine or imprisonment. Second, mutilation, an ear cut off, a hand severed. Third, death. And yet he goes. Because in his cottage, a child is coughing, ribs sharp as knives beneath her skin. Because the law does not fill a pot. He sees a deer at last, a stag, tall and still. The shot lands true, but the sound of the bowstring carries. Within hours, the foresters arrive, men in green livery, carrying clubs and dogs. Godric is dragged to the nearest manor. The carcass, evidence. The verdict, inevitable. Such scenes were common. The chroniclers call it poaching. But for most, it was survival disguised as sin. Forest law was more than cruelty. It was theatre. The hunt was the stage where nobles performed power. The king in scarlet, hawk on wrist, horn at lips, an image so deeply woven into medieval imagination that even peasants, watching from afar, believed it divine. Hunting was not about hunger, it was about hierarchy. To ride fast through a living forest was to prove one's dominion over both beast and man. The forest itself was policed like a kingdom. Rangers, verderers, foresters, each sworn to uphold the law of leaves. They patrolled paths, measured tree trunks, counted deer. Even fallen branches were accounted for. In some places, peasants were forbidden to carry bows longer than a man's arm. In others, they could not own hunting dogs, unless the animals had one paw maimed, a practice called lawing, to keep them from chasing deer. It was a world where even silence was suspicious. A man walking alone at dusk might be stopped, searched for snares, and questioned about his purpose. Gathering wood, he might say. Then where is your lord's leave? Would come the reply. To the poor, it was madness. How could God's forest belong to a man? Trees had stood before any crown. Rivers ran without permission. And yet, to live within the king's reach meant to accept the illusion. The penalty made it real. Still, resistance thrived beneath the canopy. Whole networks of poachers formed, bound by secrecy and hunger. They used coded whistles to warn of patrols. They hid carcasses under hay, disguised venison as mutton, and bribed reeves to stay silent. Sometimes even priests joined in blessing traps in exchange for a share of the meat. The forest became a shadow economy, a second world where survival depended on cunning. Legends grew from it. Stories of green-clad outlaws who robbed the rich and fed the poor. Of men like Robin Hood, half myth, half truth, who turned the forest from a prison into a refuge. Such tales were born of longing, but also of memory, the echo of older freedoms, when land belonged to those who lived upon it. Yet not all defiance wore a smile. In 1215, when English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, one of their demands was not about taxes or wars, but about the woods. They demanded limits to forest law. 2 years later, the Charter of the Forest was issued, granting common people the right to graze animals, gather wood, and fish in certain lands. It was a small crack in royal control, but for villagers like Godric, it meant life itself. Still, the forest never returned to innocence. The memory of punishment lingered like a ghost. Even centuries later, peasants told stories of the green gallows trees from which poachers were hanged as warnings. Travellers claimed to hear their names whispered in the wind. For the rich, the forest remained pleasure, falcons diving, horns echoing, dogs in pursuit. For the poor, it remained peril, a line between need and death. Yet between them both grew a strange reverence. People still crossed themselves before old oaks, still left offerings of bread or milk at roots believed to be sacred. The law could take the forest, but it could not take its spirit. When night fell, the woods reclaimed their mystery. Lanterns went out. The only sounds were owls, foxes, and the steady breathing of trees. Somewhere, a man like Godric sat by a hidden fire, sharing stolen meat with his children. The forest had fed them, as it had always done. And in that moment, no matter what the law said, it felt like grace. The medieval world did not separate law from faith. To stand accused was not merely to face justice, it was to stand before God himself. In an age before fingerprints, forensics, or juries, truth was something summoned rather than proven, and the method of summoning was ordeal. Picture a square before a small stone church. Villagers crowd around, breath steaming in the morning air. At the centre, a woman stands barefoot, hands bound, eyes fixed on a priest who holds a silver crucifix. On the ground before her lies a cauldron of water boiling, hissing, spitting steam. The priest intones words in Latin. The villagers murmur, "Amen." The woman swallows hard. Then she steps forward. This is the ordeal of boiling water. She must plunge her arm into the cauldron to retrieve a stone from its depths. If, after 3 days, her skin shows no blister or burn, she will be declared innocent, for God, they believe, protects the truthful. If her arm blisters, she is guilty. There are no surprises. The water scalds. The smell of burned flesh mixes with incense. The priest wraps her arm in linen and wax and sends her away to wait. The villagers disperse, whispering. Some pity her. Some rejoice. Everyone believes they have witnessed divine judgment. That was the heart of it. Faith that heaven would intervene directly in the affairs of men. The ordeal was not a test of evidence, but of purity. The body as courtroom, pain as testimony. The forms were many. Ordeal by fire. An accused might carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces, then have the wounds bandaged and inspected days later. Ordeal by water. The accused, bound, would be lowered into a river or pond. If they sank, they were innocent, the pure body accepted by the holy element. If they floated, it meant rejection. Guilt made them lighter than grace. To our minds, the logic seems cruel, absurd, but to theirs it was profound. They believed that the world was soaked in the divine, that every element, water, earth, flame, iron, could be a channel for God's will. A man's innocence was not proven by words, but by the universe itself. Even combat could be ordeal. The trial by battle, 2 men, one accuser and one accused, armed with sword or mace, fighting in a field before witnesses. God, it was said, would grant victory to the righteous. To decline battle was to admit guilt. A chronicler from the 12th century tells of one such duel in Normandy, 2 peasants disputing a stolen cow. The fight lasted from dawn till afternoon, until one man collapsed, bleeding into the mud. As he lay dying, he confessed, "God's judgment is just," the crowd murmured, but others whispered that he might have been simply weaker. There were women's ordeals too, often more humiliating. Some were forced to walk over burning ploughshares. Others weighed against stones or even bread, the ordeal of the morsel, in which a priest's prayer supposedly prevented the innocent from choking. Those who faltered were said to be caught by guilt itself, stuck in the throat like sin refusing to pass. To preside over an ordeal was to hold frightening power. Priests prepared the elements with ritual precision, measuring fire, blessing water, chanting psalms, yet even they feared what might happen. For if God failed to reveal the truth clearly, it might suggest doubt, or worse, indifference. The Church began to question the practice. As theology matured, thinkers like Peter Abelard and Pope Innocent III asked the dangerous question, what if God does not choose to act on command? What if pain is not proof? Their doubts were whispered first in monasteries, then in councils, until the Lateran Council of 1215 finally forbade clergy from participating. The rituals continued for a time in secret, but without priests, they lost their sacred armour. Gradually, Ordeal gave way to inquiry, to witnesses, oaths, and written evidence. The law began to listen instead of burn. Yet in the countryside, belief lingered. For generations, people still trusted the purity of elements over the corruption of men. Water does not lie, they said, and when the law became too distant, they turned again to fire and stone, holding small, secret judgments at the edges of villages. One tale from Bohemia tells of a widow accused of witchcraft. The priest refused to sanction her ordeal, so the villagers took her to the river themselves. They bound her arms, lowered her in, and watched as she sank. For a moment, silence, then bubbles. She did not rise. They pulled her out, limp and pale. God has spoken, they said. No one questioned whether he had merely remained silent. The cruelty of these trials was not born of sadism, but of fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear that truth could hide. The ordeal offered certainty, and in a world without it, people clung to the illusion that God's will could be visible. There were rare moments of mercy. Some priests, secretly skeptical, would bless the water too warm to scald, or hold the iron only briefly in the flame. They called it the miracle of God's gentleness, letting the innocent survive, a kind of quiet rebellion from within faith itself. But most left scars, men with ruined hands, women with branded skin, children who learned too early that pain and proof were the same. The law was meant to purify society, yet it often left it trembling. Still, the ordeals left their mark on the imagination. Even today we speak of trial by fire, of baptism by ordeal. The metaphors survive because the logic still tempts us that suffering reveals truth, that the soul is proven only through pain. As night falls on that long-ago village, the same bell that once summoned curfew now tolls again, this time for prayer. The woman from the ordeal kneels in her small hut, arm wrapped in linen, skin blistered but alive. She does not know what the priest will say in 3 days. She only knows the silence of her own breath, the pulse of pain, and the thought fragile, dangerous that perhaps God need not speak for her to be real. Sunday in the Middle Ages began not with sunrise, but with sound, bells, loud, insistent, unmerciful bells that tore through every valley and village, shaking sleep from even the deepest dream. You rose, weary, still sore from the week's labour, hands cracked from soil, back bent from plough, and followed their echo toward the church, because you had to. In medieval life, Sabbath rest was not a choice. It was commandment turned legislation, written into the rhythm of the week. The seventh day was God's day, Domini dies, and to break it was both sin and crime. For the poorest labourers, that commandment carried strange irony. Rest was sacred, but only because work was relentless. In a world where daylight dictated survival, the idea of a day without labour was both miracle and burden. The church doors stood open. Inside, smoke rose from candles, their scent mingling with damp stone and breath. The priest spoke in Latin words most could not understand, but whose tone carried the weight of eternity. You knelt, stood, crossed yourself when others did, your stomach growling, your knees aching on cold flagstones. Outside, the fields waited silently. The oxen stood tethered. The plough, half sunk in earth, was still. Even the wind seemed hushed, as if afraid to disturb the holy calm. To work on Sunday to shear sheep, mend fences, or bake bread was to defy both heaven and village. Fines were common. Public penance was worse. You might be made to stand barefoot in the churchyard, holding your tools of sin, a spindle, a hoe, a half-shaped loaf. The congregation would watch. The priest would bless you and shame you in the same breath. And yet, beneath the discipline, something human survived. The Sabbath gave the weary a pause, however enforced. For one day the whip of necessity loosened. Families gathered, ate together, mended clothes, told stories. Children played without scolding. A neighbour might visit not to barter or borrow, but simply to sit. In some parishes, the Sabbath became a quiet form of rebellion. Peasants, forbidden from toil, turned rest into celebration. They brewed ale the night before, played dice behind barns, or whispered songs the priest called sinful but the people called sweet. Even idleness could feel like freedom. Still, the church watched. Rest was not leisure, it was obedience. The official purpose was prayer, not play. Too much laughter could be mistaken for irreverence, too much ease for pride. Sermons often warned of those who plough the Lord's day. Chronicles describe punishments meant to terrify. A man struck blind for sharpening his scythe on Sunday. A woman swallowed by the earth for baking bread. Whether real or myth, these tales travelled far, keeping fear alive. The logic, in truth, was not entirely cruel. The Sabbath protected the body as much as the soul. Medieval life offered no vacations, no pensions, no weekends. Rest was rationed through religion. By commanding a day of stillness, the church gave the labourer one chance to survive the year. The body, wrote a monk from Cluny, is the vessel of God's work. To let it break is to sin against his creation. Yet rest carried cost. The lord of the manor did not pause his demands. Taxes, rents and debts accumulated even while the hands that earned them were folded in prayer. A man could lose a day's wages to holiness. A woman could lose her place in the market. Still, something sacred took root in the silence. The Sabbath morning was the one time the village stood as equals. Peasant and reeve, servant and craftsman, all kneeling side by side beneath the same roof. Even the Lord attended Mass, though he sat apart in his carved pew. The incense drifted over them all, fragrant and impartial. For a brief hour, hierarchy thinned. After service came the long afternoon. Fields remained untouched, but taverns filled quietly. Ale flowed, gossip warmed. The line between reverence and routine blurred. In coastal towns, sailors mended nets discreetly behind doors. In mountain villages, shepherds still checked their flocks, whispering apologies to the sky. Everyone sinned a little, carefully. Even nature seemed to honour the day. Chronicles mention birdsong louder on Sundays, the wind gentler, fires burning longer. Such tales were not believed literally, but believed emotionally. The Sabbath had become not just command, but comfort. In one old manuscript from Burgundy, a monk describes walking through the village at dusk on a Sunday. The smoke rose straight, as if the air itself prayed. He wrote, "No hammer sounded, no bellows blew, only the distant low of cattle and the quiet breath of the people who for once did not strive." The thought lingers. Rest itself was a radical act. In a world built on toil, to do nothing to simply exist was both grace and defiance. Still, rest was fragile. The moment the evening bell rang, the spell broke. Fires were rekindled, hands reached for tools, and the rhythm of survival resumed. The Sabbath faded into memory, its peace folded neatly away like a clean cloth, ready to be soiled again by the week to come. But something of that silence endured. The idea that the human spirit requires pause, that the soul, like the soil, needs its fallow season began here, in the cold stone churches, in the tired hearts of peasants, in the stillness enforced by fear yet remembered for mercy. So the bell that once ordered obedience came to mean something else over centuries, not the sound of power, but the sound of permission. Permission, at last, to rest. In a medieval town, your hands were never entirely your own. Every hammer strike, every loaf of bread, every thread pulled through a loom, all of it belonged, in some way, to someone else. That someone was the guild. The guild was part trade union, part cartel, part secret society. It was the silent machinery that ran medieval life. If you were a blacksmith, a weaver, a baker, or a mason, the guild was your gatekeeper to survival. Imagine the sound of morning in a narrow street of craftsmen, the clang of iron from one shop, the smell of yeast from another, sawdust floating in beams of light. Each door bears a carved sign, a horseshoe, a loaf, a spindle. But behind every sign is not just a craftsman, but an entire hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices governed by rules older than memory. To join a guild was to surrender freedom in exchange for security. You could not simply open a workshop because you felt inspired. First came apprenticeship, 7 years, sometimes more, spent under a master. You swept his floor, fetched his tools, memorized his secrets. You learned when to strike iron, when to let it rest, how to mix clay or temper glass. You lived in his house, obeyed his wife, ate his bread. You were not just trained, you were shaped. Only after those long years could you become a journeyman from the French journée, meaning a day's work. You could earn wages, travel between towns, and practice your craft, but you still lacked independence. To open your own shop, you had to prove mastery by creating a single, perfect piece. It was called your masterpiece, a cabinet without flaw, a sword that did not bend or break, a loaf that baked evenly, neither too hard nor too soft. This object would be examined by the guild elders, men whose eyes had seen decades of deceit and brilliance. If your work passed their scrutiny, you were permitted to call yourself master. If it failed, you started again. Sometimes, men grew old without ever earning the title. But to be a master was not freedom either. It was duty. Guilds controlled prices, production, and even the size of your workshop. If you charged too little, you undercut your peers, a sin. Too much, and you were greedy, also a sin. Every object had its place. Every craftsman his quota. The guild inspected tools, weighed goods, and punished those who broke its rules. There was comfort in this system. It ensured quality, fairness, stability. A cobbler could trust his neighbours not to ruin the trade by selling shoddy shoes. A customer could buy a loaf knowing it met the guild's weight. In a world without factories, guilds were the closest thing to regulation craftsmanship, bound by honour and fear. But there was also suffocation. Innovation often died in its cradle. A weaver who tried a new dye might be fined for unlicensed practice. A baker who used a cheaper grain could be accused of fraud. Guilds prized tradition, not invention. The motto was, "As our fathers did, so do we." And yet, the human spark found ways to flicker. Journeymen carried techniques between towns, spreading quiet revolutions, new patterns in cloth, new alloys in metal, new shapes in stone. Even under watchful eyes, progress whispered. Guilds were not only about work, they were families, faiths, and miniature governments. Each had its patron saint, Street Eligius for goldsmiths, Street Crispin for shoemakers, Street Honoré for bakers. Feast days were marked with processions, candles, and banners stitched with symbols of trade, hammers crossed, shears open, wheat bound in ribbon. On those days, the guild's workshop became a chapel, its labour a form of prayer. They also cared for their own, or said they did. When a member fell ill, the guild paid his doctor. When a craftsman died, it buried him, sometimes beneath a stone carved with the tools of his trade. Widows and orphans received charity from the guild chest. This sense of brotherhood gave meaning to a life of discipline, but the guild's power could turn cruel. It excluded women, except in a few trades like brewing or textiles. It barred outsiders, immigrants, and anyone deemed unworthy, which often meant simply poor. In great cities, guilds grew so rich they rivaled the authority of kings. Their masters became politicians, their halls palaces of oak and glass. The line between craftsman and merchant blurred. For the ordinary worker, though, the rules never softened. He woke to bells, worked to quotas, slept beneath debt. The guild promised protection but demanded submission. And woe to the man who defied it. There's a story from 14th century Florence of a dyer who tried to start his own business outside the guild's approval. His colours were said to glow brighter than anyone's. The other masters accused him of sorcery. His shop was closed. His vats poured into the river. He vanished, and his secret with him. Centuries later, cloths from his short-lived workshop still shimmer faintly, their colours refusing to fade, a quiet rebellion preserved in silk. The guilds ruled for hundreds of years, long after their founders turned to dust. But time eroded their walls. Trade expanded, towns grew, and new forces, merchants, bankers, machines began to question their control. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the same spirit of innovation the guilds once suppressed would finally unmake them. Still, their shadow lingers in every craft, every workshop, every artist who seeks perfection before claiming mastery. The medieval guild may be gone, but its lesson endures, that the price of excellence is often obedience, and that every masterpiece, before it becomes art, must first pass through judgment. Before the clock, there was only the bell. In the medieval world, time did not belong to the sun or to the seasons, it belonged to sound. The tolling of iron against air was the pulse by which people lived. When it rang, you rose. When it rang again, you prayed, worked, ate or slept. And when it rang once more, you stopped everything, knelt and remembered that your time was not yours at all. For peasants, the bell tower was both tyrant and guardian. Its voice carried over fields and rivers, through mist and rain. You could not see the priest who rang it, but you obeyed him as surely as you obeyed gravity. The rhythm was relentless. Matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, nuns in the afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline at night. The liturgy of hours was the heartbeat of the medieval day. Imagine a farmer in a distant field, bent over a plough. The sound arrives faintly at first, a hum across the hills, then clear, commanding. He straightens his back, wipes sweat from his brow, mutters a prayer to the Virgin, and begins again. The bell has reminded him not of God's presence, but of God's schedule. In towns, the bells multiplied. Each church, monastery, and civic hall had its own pattern, each claiming authority over the same hours. Sometimes they clashed, ringing slightly out of sync, so that the air itself seemed to shimmer with confusion. Travellers described the experience as being inside a storm of time, and yet people found comfort in it. The bells gave order to chaos. In a world where few could read calendars and most could not count hours, sound became certainty. Morning was not when the sun rose, but when the bell said it was. Night was not when darkness fell, but when the curfew called it so. The curfew couvre-feu, cover the fire, was one of the strictest bells of all. At its ringing, hearths were to be smothered, candles extinguished, doors barred. The bell did not ask, it commanded. To ignore it was to invite fine, punishment, or worse, the wrath of your neighbours, whose safety depended on your obedience. In towns built of wood and straw, one careless flame could mean ruin for all. But there was more to it than fire. Darkness was dangerous. When the curfew rang, it told you, go inside. The world beyond your door belongs to others now. Thieves, spirits, hunger. For peasants, it was a forced surrender tonight. For nobles, it was assurance that the streets were theirs alone. The irony was that the bells, meant to unite, also divided. Monasteries rang them to mark prayer, towns to mark trade, castles to mark curfew. The same sound that summoned a monk to devotion summoned a peasant to submission. The bells told everyone where they belonged. Yet not all obeyed. There were whispers of those who worked through the night, blacksmiths who forged under the moon, millers who ground grain secretly after curfew to feed the poor. They said the devil helped such men keep time in silence, with no bells to guide them. Others said it was mercy, not sin, that kept their hammers moving in the dark. Inside monasteries, bells had a gentler meaning. For monks, each toll was a conversation with eternity. The sound drifted over cloisters like the breath of an angel. They said the bell's voice was shaped by prayer, that a careless ringer produced noise, but a devout one could make the air itself bow. The largest bells were given names: Maria, Salvator, Gabriel. They were baptized in holy water before being hung, their bronze considered sacred. But for villagers, the bell's tone could bring dread. A single toll, slow, mournful, meant death. 2 for a woman, 3 for a man. A rapid peal meant fire. A confused, uneven clamour meant invasion or war. Some chroniclers wrote that entire towns learned to interpret these sounds as instinctively as heartbeat. There's a story from Flanders of a man who could tell, by the pitch of a bell, the distance of a storm. He claimed the sound travelled differently when the air held lightning. He died during Mass one summer afternoon, lightning striking the tower above him mid-peal. The villagers said the bells had called their most faithful listener home. As centuries passed, bells grew larger, more complex. Some were tuned to harmonies, their chimes arranged in melodies that rolled over cities like music from heaven. The greatest of them, like Notre Dame's Emmanuel, or England's Great Tom, could shake the earth. When they rang, kings paused, priests crossed themselves, and peasants wept without knowing why. Yet even then, the same paradox endured. The bell was both master and comforter. It reminded you of the passage of time, but also of time's meaning. Every toll was both command and consolation, a voice saying, "You are small, but not forgotten." When mechanical clocks appeared in the 14th century, the bells did not fall silent. They adapted. Now, instead of priests, gears controlled their rhythm. Time had become a machine. But the habit of listening remained. People still looked up at the tower when they heard the sound, still paused, still obeyed. Even now, in towns where no one ploughs or prays to the bell, the echo remains in the language. Curfew, a clock, ringing in the hour. The medieval habit of measuring life by sound still lingers in the subconscious, that faint, ancient instinct to look up when we hear metal sing. Because once, long ago, the bell was more than timekeeping. It was the voice of order in a world of uncertainty. It was the boundary between chaos and peace. And when it fell silent, you knew that something had gone terribly wrong. In the medieval imagination, dirt was never just physical, it was moral. To wash the body was to flirt with vanity, but to leave it unwashed was to risk disease. Between those two fears, an entire theology of cleanliness was born. If you had lived then, water would have frightened you almost as much as it cleansed you. Rivers carried life and death in equal measure. Wells could cure or kill. And yet, across Europe, the scent of soap and steam still lingered faintly over the centuries, proof that even in an age of filth, the longing for purity never died. Bathing, contrary to legend, was not forgotten in the Middle Ages. It was complicated. In towns, public bathhouses stood near rivers and markets, warmed by great furnaces that smoked day and night. They were social places, not the private marble sanctuaries of Rome, but timbered rooms filled with steam and gossip. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, sometimes together. The church frowned, but the people continued, murmuring that a clean body pleased God as much as a clean soul. Inside, wooden tubs were lined with cloth to soften the heat. Water was scented with herbs, rosemary for strength, lavender for calm, mint for clarity. Steam fogged the air. Candles flickered through the haze. Merchants discussed business there. Monks debated scripture. Lovers whispered through curtains of vapour. Some bathhouses even served food-roasted fish, spiced wine, turning cleanliness into celebration. But the warmth carried danger. Where bodies gathered, so did suspicion. Moralists warned that steam opened not only pores but temptation. The devil, wrote one preacher, enters through the comfort of the skin. Bathhouses began to be linked with sin, with vanity, idleness, or worse. By the 13th century, cities like Paris and London placed restrictions on them. Then came plague. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, killing millions, fear reshaped everything. Doctors claimed that bathing made the body vulnerable, that hot water opened the humours and let in pestilence. People stopped washing. Streets filled with the smell of sweat, rot, and incense meant to mask it. Soap, once a small luxury, became suspicious. Dirt was thought to seal the skin from death. And yet, not everyone obeyed the fear. In monasteries, ritual washing remained sacred. Before prayer, before meals, before touching holy objects, monks cleansed their hands in stone basins fed by fresh springs. Water was purification, the element of baptism, God's original instrument of renewal. Even when towns stank, monasteries shimmered with the quiet sound of trickling fountains. Peasants, too, bathed when they could in rivers during summer, in wooden tubs near the hearth in winter. They scrubbed with ashes and sand, dried with rough cloth, and called it good enough. Cleanliness was a gift of circumstance, not morality. The wealthy, meanwhile, turned hygiene into theatre. Noble ladies soaked in milk to soften the skin. Men perfumed their hair with rose oil or musk. The more lavish the bath, the holier they claimed it to be. If God made water, said one French knight, he meant it for those who can afford warmth. But the church drew a line between cleanliness and pride. To wash too often was vanity. To smell of perfume was sin. Priests preached moderation. Wash your conscience before your body, they said. Still, bishops themselves bathed regularly, wrapped in linen and guarded by servants. Hypocrisy smelled faintly of sandalwood. In the north, the tradition endured longer. Scandinavians built saunas, log huts with stones heated until they glowed, where people sweated, prayed, and struck their own backs with birch branches to drive out sickness. Travellers described these rituals with fascination and disdain, unable to decide if they were health or heresy. By the late Middle Ages, the bathhouse had become both sanctuary and scandal. In some cities, they doubled as brothels. In others, they were disguised hospitals. Physicians prescribed baths for melancholy, infertility, even moral despair. The warmth of water, one wrote, brings memory of Eden. Then, little by little, the water cooled. Fear of plague, moral panic, and new ideas about modesty closed the doors. Bathhouses rotted, pipes rusted, and the sound of shared laughter and steam faded into silence. For centuries afterward, Europeans would wear perfume instead of soap, linen instead of cleanliness, and call it virtue. But the memory of bathing never vanished entirely. In quiet corners, old habits survived: a bucket by the hearth, a stream behind the mill. Mothers still washed their children before Mass. Soldiers still scrubbed before battle. Water remained sacred, even if shame tried to dam it. There's a tale from a convent in France. During a terrible fever, A nun dreamt of angels carrying basins of warm water, washing the sores of the sick. When she woke, she defied her abbess and began bathing patients herself. The others followed. The fever passed. They called her Sister of the Pure Spring. And so, beneath the superstition and the sermons, the truth remained. People have always longed to be clean not only of dirt, but of the heaviness of being human. To wash was to begin again, even if only for a moment. When evening fell and the bathhouse fires dimmed, the last thing you heard was the drip of cooling water. It echoed like a heartbeat, like a whisper. You are made of earth, but also of water. Do not forget either. When the sun fell in the Middle Ages, the world did not sleep, it hid. Day belonged to labour, but night belonged to law, or rather, to the absence of it. Darkness was a frontier that terrified even kings. It was when rules bent, faces vanished, and the thin thread of order trembled in the wind. For the commoner, nightfall was not peace, it was curfew. The couvre-feu bell still rang each evening, warning villagers to cover fires, bar doors, and retreat indoors. Streets emptied, gates closed, markets fell silent. In towns, the air thickened with the scent of smoke and tallow as shutters slammed one by one. To be outside after the bell without cause, without lantern, without a reason that pleased the constable, was to risk accusation, or worse. Still, the dark had its keepers. The night watchmen armed with staves, lanterns, and sharp ears patrolled alleys, calling out the hours in rhymes. Past 10 of the clock and all's well. But not all was well. Behind their calls lay fear of thieves, fire, plague, and spirits. They carried horns to sound alarms, and cudgels to remind wanderers that peace was a fragile thing held together by force. Imagine London around 1300. The river smells of fish and refuse. The cobblestones are slick with rain. A watchman passes, his torch painting the walls in orange light. Somewhere nearby, a drunk sings off-key. A door slams, then silence again, deep enough to hear the drip of the Thames against the wharf. The watchman's eyes dart between shadows, because the night had its own citizens. There were cut-purses and footpads, thieves who moved like smoke through the narrow lanes. There were smugglers unloading contraband from boats, lovers meeting behind churchyards, beggars sleeping beneath arcades, and outlaws returned in secret to see the families who still dared to feed them. Every crime of the night was born from the day's hunger, and yet, not all darkness was wicked. In the fields beyond the walls, shepherds kept vigil beside their flocks. Millers tended slow-turning wheels. Monks prayed in midnight offices called matins, their chants drifting through the dark like low constellations of sound. For them, night was not danger but discipline, a time when the soul, unmasked by sunlight, spoke more clearly. To the rest of the world, though, night remained suspect. Town laws were full of its fear. In Paris, no one could carry weapons after curfew. In York, no stranger was allowed inside the gates once the sun had set. Inns were required to lock doors and extinguish lamps. Bakers, smiths, and brewers faced heavy fines for working after hours, lest fire or sin ignite. Superstition wrapped itself around these laws like ivy. People whispered that demons prowled crossroads, that witches met under gallows trees, that ghosts walked the paths of the newly dead until dawn. Candles burned in windows not for light but for protection. Even dreams were suspect too vivid, and you might be accused of traffic with the devil. But where fear ruled, opportunity followed. Some learned to move invisibly through that forbidden time, the nightmen who cleaned privies and carried away waste, the midwives summoned to births, the guards who tended bridges and walls. They were half respected, half avoided, living between worlds. Their torches were the only stars in the labyrinth of streets. Others defied the darkness more boldly. Poets and chroniclers wrote of nocturnes, gatherings of artisans, musicians and storytellers, who met after curfew to share songs and secrets. One account from Bruges tells of weavers who covered their windows with cloth to hide candlelight, reciting romances, while a lookout listened for the watch. "The world is quieter at night," one of them said, and so truth dares to speak. The church tried to reclaim the hours of darkness by sanctifying them. Midnight masses, vigils, and processions filled the void where fear festered. Bells rang softly through the blackness, a promise that even the night belonged to God. But the line was never secure. The same bells that called to prayer could also sound alarm. Punishments for nocturnal crimes were harsh. A thief caught by night could lose a hand or hang without trial. The same offence by day might earn only a fine. Darkness magnified guilt. It made every sin look larger, every motive more cunning. Judges spoke of the crime of the shadow, as though night itself were an accomplice. And yet, the night had defenders. Philosophers argued that rest and darkness were divine gifts, that the world's silence was a kind of healing. The sun humbles the poor, wrote one monk, but the moon makes all men equal. In moonlight, rags and silk shone alike. Perhaps that was what rulers feared most, that the dark erased distinctions. By the late 15th century, the arrival of street lanterns began to change everything. First in Italy, then in Paris and London, oil lamps flickered along main roads. For the first time, darkness was challenged, not with prayer but with flame. The people rejoiced. The night watch cursed the extra work. But something delicate was lost. Where shadows once hid mystery, light revealed banality rats, refuse, tired men. Night was no longer a kingdom of whispers, but a corridor of commerce. The curfew softened, the watch grew lazier, and fear shifted from spirits to thieves with clearer faces. Still, in small villages and empty moors, true night endured vast, thick and breathing. When all candles were out and even the watchman's call had faded, the world returned to its ancient state, unseen, unmeasured, infinite. And in that darkness, peasants dreamed. They dreamed of better harvests, of warmth, of justice, of waking to a world where fear did not ring with every bell. The night might have belonged to danger, but in dreams it belonged to them. Justice in the Middle Ages was a spectacle. It had to be because punishment was not only about the body, it was about the example. Where modern law hides its vengeance behind walls, medieval law performed it in the square. The people were not only witnesses, they were part of the machinery. The humiliation of one was the instruction of all. At dawn, the market square stirs. Merchants pull open their stalls. Children chase each other between barrels. Then the sound of a drum cuts through the chatter. Heads turn. Guards appear, followed by a man in chains. His face is grey with fear and sleeplessness. Around his neck hangs a sign declaring his crime. Thief. He is led to the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for head and hands. The crowd gathers, murmuring. Someone throws a rotten apple. Someone spits. The priest prays aloud for his soul. The mayor nods to the guard, who locks the wooden beam shut. The man will stand there for hours, exposed to sun, jeers, and shame. It is not the pain that breaks him, it is the eyes. Hundreds of them. The public punishment turns private sin into civic theatre. The body becomes a message. This is what wrong looks like. There were many such devices. The stocks held the feet, leaving a person sitting helpless in filth. The pillory displayed the upper body. The whipping post did what its name promised. There were ducking stools for gossiping women, cucking stools for dishonest bakers, iron collars for beggars and thieves. Each had its ritual, its audience, its rhythm of humiliation. But not every punishment was meant to kill. Most were designed to humiliate, to stain the soul in public memory long after bruises faded. The medieval mind believed that shame cleansed as fire did, painfully, visibly, and completely. The spectacle had its logic. In a world where prisons were rare and expensive, deterrence had to be immediate. A thief hanging at the crossroads served more purpose than 100 sermons. People would pass, cross themselves and whisper, "So perish all who steal." The gallows, however, were not only instruments of justice, they were symbols of authority. Every lord had the right to erect one on his land, visible from afar, proof that law reached even into the hills. High justice, they called it. The higher the beam, the greater the power. There's a chilling record from 1325 of a gallows in Burgundy, so tall it was visible for miles, built to hang 3 men at once. Travellers called it the King's Shadow. Beneath it, wildflowers grew nourished, they said, by fear. But not all punishments ended in death. Many ended in exile. A branded cheek, a missing ear, a severed hand, these were the marks of the law. To bear them was to carry your sentence forever, a walking warning. Some cut purses, tattooed false scars to appear punished already, hoping to escape suspicion. The law had created its own camouflage. For women, the penalties often cut deeper into dignity. Adulteresses were shaved bald, paraded through the streets in their underclothes, forced to beg forgiveness at church steps. Better to burn, one chronicler wrote, than to live shorn. The idea was to strip away vanity, to expose sin as ugliness. But beneath it lay fear. Fear of women's power to charm, to deceive, to choose. In villages, the line between law and vengeance was thin. A thief caught in the act could be beaten by a mob before any trial. Justice was personal, primal. The community itself became judge and executioner, bound together by fury. The law of the crowd. Some priests called it a law as swift as it was merciless. And yet, not all punishment was cruelty. There were moments of mercy, of strange tenderness. A lord might pardon a man for saving a life. A priest might intercede for a widow. In some towns, criminals could escape hanging by grasping the ring of a church door claiming sanctuary. Once inside holy walls, they had 40 days to confess or flee the kingdom. The sight of a man clutching the church ring, breathless, terrified, became a familiar image of desperate faith. There is one tale from York of a butcher, accused of murder, who fled into a chapel at midnight. He grasped the sanctuary ring so tightly his hands bled. For 40 days, townsfolk brought him bread and water. On the last night, he was seen walking away under the moon, barefoot, headed toward the coast. No one stopped him. They said the angels had taken his place on the gallows at dawn. Whether true or not, the story shows something vital about medieval minds. Punishment was not just about ending life, but restoring order. A world that believed in sin had to believe in balance. Justice was not reason, it was ritual. But rituals evolve. By the 15th century, towns began to build enclosed prisons. The spectacle moved indoors. Chains replaced crowds. The law became quieter, colder. Some mourned the change, others called it progress. The age of public shame was ending, but its echo never left. Even now, when we say, "pay for your crimes," we echo that old belief that wrongdoing creates a debt which must be seen, measured, and repaid. The medieval pillory has vanished, but its ghost lives on in headlines, in gossip, in the instinct to point, to humiliate, to watch. In their world, guilt was carved into flesh. In ours, it is carved into memory. And perhaps, in both, the true punishment was never the pain, it was the gaze of others, the mirror of their judgment. The medieval marketplace was the heart of the town, noisy, fragrant, alive. It was where peasants met merchants, gossip met gold, and survival met law. But beneath the chatter of vendors and the clatter of carts, an invisible system ruled every grain, every measure, every crumb. It was called the assize of bread and ale, and it was one of the most obsessive laws in medieval history. At first glance, it seemed simple, to ensure that bakers and brewers sold fair portions at fair prices. In truth, it was an attempt to control the rhythm of hunger itself. Bread was life. For the poor, it could make up more than half of daily calories. To cheat on bread was to threaten the foundation of existence. So the crown made its decree. Each loaf must weigh exactly as much as the price of grain allowed, no less. If flour grew costly, loaves must shrink. If harvests were rich, they must swell. Every loaf, therefore, became a kind of mirror of the economy, a silent report of the land's fortune. Inspectors known as ale-conners and bread-weighers patrolled the stalls. They carried scales and rods, testing the weight of loaves, the purity of beer, the honesty of merchants. A dishonest baker could be fined, flogged, or worse, fastened in the pillory. His underbaked bread hung around his neck as proof of deceit. But the rule's intent was not cruelty, it was survival. The medieval city lived and died by trust. No one could check prices or store surpluses for long. Famine arrived faster than justice. The assize was the crown's promise that fairness could exist even when the sky refused to rain. Still, hunger has a way of breaking promises. Imagine a small English town in the late 13th century. The harvest has failed. The river has flooded, ruining grain stores. Bread doubles in price. The law demands that loaves shrink accordingly, but the people are furious. Smaller bread means smaller lives. Crowds gather in the square. Women clutch empty baskets, shouting for justice. A baker named Thomas tries to explain, "It's the law, not me." But law is cold comfort to an empty stomach. Someone hurls a stone. The crowd surges. By nightfall, his stall is in flames. The next day, a royal official arrives to hang 3 of the rioters. The loaves return to their measured size, but the town will whisper for generations that the law weighed heavier than mercy. Bread was not the only obsession. Beer ale was equally sacred. In an age when water could sicken and wine was for the rich, Ale was the people's drink. Thick, cloudy, nourishing. It was breakfast and supper both, so the assize extended its reach. Every brewer, usually a woman known as an alewife, had to sell at a fixed price and strength. Inspectors would visit taverns, dipping ladles into barrels to taste the brew. Too weak, and it was fraud. Too strong, and it was indulgence. Alewives caught cheating might be forced to sit in the tumbrel, a wooden cart used for carrying refuse, and be paraded through town, their skirts soaked with their own spoiled beer. Some records from York and Bristol show women fined for making ale too bitter, for drawing beer with false measure, or for refusing the tester a cup. The punishments were harsh, but the reason was fear. Bad ale could kill, and dishonesty could spread faster than plague. In this strange union of holiness and hunger, even measurements became moral. Scales were kept in the church. Standard loaves were blessed at the altar before being shown to bakers as models. Cheating was not just theft, it was sin. One chronicler tells of a baker who swore innocence until the host was held before him. Then he confessed at once, trembling. The crowd called it a miracle, yet markets were never pure. In corners and alleys, men sold false weights, watered wine, or mixed sawdust into flour. Women whispered about merchants who hid extra stones inside scales. And though officials patrolled with rods and rules, everyone knew that bribery was the truest measure. Still, amid corruption, something sacred persisted, the belief that food was not mere commerce, but covenant. The baker's oven, the brewer's vat, the butcher's stall, these were altars where labour met grace. To cheat there was to desecrate. It was not all punishment. Festivals often reversed the tension. On bread day, some towns gave out free loaves to the poor, blessed by priests and sprinkled with holy water. Children ran laughing through the square, holding bread high as protection against famine. The Lord's body, people said, half jokingly, half true. When famine struck in earnest, as it often did, the law faltered, and charity took its place. Monasteries opened their gates to feed the starving. Guilds distributed grain from secret stores. Even lords, fearing revolt, sometimes forgave debts or cut rents. Hunger, for all its cruelty, could teach compassion that law could not. And yet, the idea of the just loaf survived. When the Renaissance dawned, new markets rose and old guilds fell, but the obsession with weight and measure lingered. Every government since every tax, every standard, every barcode and receipt is a descendant of that medieval dream, that fairness could be counted in ounces and judged by scales. There's a saying from the 14th century carved into a London guild hall: when bread is false, all else will follow. It meant that honesty was the first ingredient of civilization, and that a world where the loaf lies will soon rot at the core. And so the baker weighed his dough, the alewife tested her brew, and the people trusted because trust was bread, and bread was life. The year was 1348, and death had learned to travel. It moved in caravans and ships, in rags and fleas, in whispers carried faster than any bell. People called it many names: the great mortality, the pestilence, God's punishment, but it needed no name. It was the smell in the air, the silence in the street, the blackness on the skin. The Black Death changed everything, including the rules that once defined the world. Before it came, law and custom had been slow, patient, eternal. Guilds set prices, lords commanded labour, priests commanded souls. After it came, all of that cracked. No sermon, no sword, no seal could hold against what crept through the body. The first signs were small: a cough in the market, a baker's stall left unattended, a bell tolling too soon. Then the bells became constant, tolling not hours but lives. Graveyards filled, fields emptied. Monks died faster than they could pray. Families fled their homes and locked the doors behind them, leaving the sick to die alone. The law tried to follow, but it was like chasing smoke. In towns, officials issued edicts: no man to enter without inspection, no woman to wash clothes in the river, no funerals beyond 6 attendants. But no one could enforce them. The enforcers were dying too. Courts closed, trade stopped, and the only authority left was fear. For the first time, people questioned not only the rules but the rule makers. When priests died alongside peasants, the hierarchy of holiness collapsed. When lords fled their estates, peasants remained behind to bury their dead and tend the fields. And when the plague finally ebbed, the survivors looked around and saw a world reshaped, not by kings, but by absence. In England, A third of the population was gone. So few labourers remained that wages rose like never before. The rich panicked. Who would till their land, mend their roofs, grind their grain? They tried to restore the old order with parchment and wax. In 1351, King Edward III issued the Statute of Labourers. Every man and woman, free or bond, shall serve for the same wages as in the 20th year of our reign, and none shall refuse to work, upon pain of imprisonment. It was an act of desperation, a law against scarcity itself. Peasants who demanded higher pay could be jailed. Labourers who left their manors in search of better work could be branded with the letter F for fugitive. But the plague had done what no rebellion could. It had taught the poor their value. Imagine a field in spring, years after the plague's worst. The sky is pale, the soil soft. A young ploughman named Will works alone where once a dozen men stood. There are now two. The reeve rides up, shouting the old rate of pay. Will straightens, wipes his brow, and says quietly, "Then plough it yourself." No law could unteach that sentence. Everywhere, the balance shifted. Lords offered food, freedom or coin just to keep tenants on their land. Guilds relaxed their iron rules. Even the church, desperate for novices, admitted men once deemed unworthy. The plague, by killing so many, had given strange birth to equality. But equality frightened those who survived in comfort. Rumours spread that God's order was unravelling. Preachers thundered that sin had made the world unrecognisable. Others whispered that the plague had been sent not as punishment, but as cleansing, that the world had been too crowded, too proud. The church struggled to reclaim control. It banned new forms of worship, punished those who sought answers outside its walls. But doubt had already entered the bloodstream of Europe, more contagious than any disease. In Italy, city-states began to rely not on prayer but on policy. They built lazarettos, quarantine islands, the first of their kind, and posted guards to keep ships from docking. 40 days, they decreed, from the Italian Quaranta. Thus was born the quarantine, a word still carrying the echo of that terror. Elsewhere, laws grew darker. Foreigners were blamed, so were beggars, lepers, Jews. Pogroms erupted. Entire communities burned on the rumour that they had poisoned the wells. The hysteria gave the dying a brief illusion of control, as if purging others could cleanse the air. Later, chroniclers would write that the plague killed bodies, but fear killed souls. Yet amid horror, compassion persisted. In Paris, doctors volunteered to tend the infected, though they knew the cost. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI ordered his servants to light fires day and night around the palace to purify the air, then used his own funds to bury thousands. In England, villagers formed fraternities of mercy groups who collected corpses by cart, ringing bells and reciting prayers for strangers. The dead were nameless, but they were not forgotten. The world that emerged was quieter, emptier, and strangely freer. Fields reclaimed by weeds became grazing lands. Abandoned manors crumbled into ruins that travellers mistook for ancient temples. And through it all, a new awareness spread that laws could not outlive the people who made them. For the first time, ordinary men began to see themselves not just as servants of order, but as survivors of it. They had faced death, and found no king waiting beyond the grave, only the silence of God and the stubbornness of life. A century later, that same stubbornness would fuel revolts. The Peasants' Revolt in England, the Sumptuary uprising in Florence, the Hussite Wars in Bohemia. Each carried a trace of the plague's lesson, that obedience can die faster than flesh. And yet, even as rebellions smouldered, one truth endured, whispered by priests and peasants alike. Death makes equals of us all, but survival teaches who we truly are. So they rebuilt, brick by brick, law by law, hunger by hunger, and though the bells still rang for the dead, they now rang for something else too, for the living, and the new world they had been forced to invent. When plague loosened its grip and the world began to breathe again, something unexpected filled the silence it left behind laughter. It was a strange, nervous kind of laughter at first, rising from the same throats that had spent years crying prayers over graves. But once it began, it did not stop. It became plays, songs, carnivals. Europe, weary of mourning, rediscovered its appetite for absurdity. And so the age of moral theatre was born, half sermon, half spectacle. Imagine a market square at dusk. A wagon rattles in, draped in painted cloth. A crowd gathers, peasants in patched cloaks, merchants with purses, children with sticky hands. Trumpets blare, and out step the players, not noble actors, but travelling craftsmen, jugglers, and preachers in disguise. One wears a gilded mask of pride, another the rags of greed, another a skeleton's grin. They shout, sing, stumble, and dance, turning sins into characters. Pride boasts until he's tripped by envy. Gluttony gorges on apples until death leads him away by the wrist. The crowd laughs, then shudders. The lesson lands. This was the medieval stage, rough, raw, but alive. It belonged not to palaces but to the people, and though it preached virtue, it also gave them something more precious, a mirror. The church tolerated the performances because they taught doctrine to the illiterate, yet even the priests could feel the danger in them. When common folk began to act out devils, when women played the Virgin, when peasants recited lines once reserved for pulpits, the world began to blur. Who was preaching now, and who was pretending? In cities, the plays grew grander. Guilds competed to sponsor the biggest pageants. The creation of Adam, the flood, the passion. Whole streets became stages. But alongside the holy dramas rose another kind, the mystery of mockery, Carnival. Once a year, before Lent, the world turned itself upside down. Servants dressed as lords, women as men, fools as kings. Parades wound through towns with masks, music, and wine. The church called it a necessary sin, a brief inversion to remind everyone why order mattered. But for the people, it was rebellion wrapped in laughter. During Carnival, even the poorest could wear velvet, even the sternest monk could drink and dance. It was a season of permitted blasphemy, a sigh of release between fasts. The same lips that sang hymns on Sunday now shouted songs of nonsense and desire. And yet, beneath the chaos lay something serious. The laughter was not empty, it was survival, a language for pain too vast to confess aloud. The same towns that had watched their neighbours die now laughed at death itself, painting him as a clumsy fool with a rattle of bones. The dance of death, dance macabre, spread across Europe like a fever of defiance. Artists painted it on church walls, skeletons leading popes, kings and peasants in one unbroken chain, all grinning the same grin. The message was grim, but liberating, that all flesh, holy or humble, ended in the same embrace. The people laughed not because they were careless, but because laughter was the only weapon left against despair. The church, uneasy, tried to keep control. Priests reminded crowds that these plays were to teach humility, not to indulge it, but faith and folly had mingled too deeply to separate. A man could kneel in the morning and mock a bishop in the afternoon, and feel both acts holy. For the poor, theatre became a way to remember dignity. For the rich, a way to disguise their own guilt in jest. And for the thinkers of the age, those early stirrings of Renaissance minds, it became a tool sharper than any sword, satire. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer turned their pens on hypocrisy, cloaking truth in humour. Through tales of pilgrims, millers and friars, they showed that wisdom could hide in wit and sin in sanctity. The medieval world, once divided by class and creed, found common ground in laughter. There's an old English verse from the time when all are fools, none be shamed, when all are masked, none are named. That was the secret of medieval comedy, its mercy. In laughter, everyone could be ridiculous, and therefore everyone could be forgiven. But the laughter had limits. When famine returned or war came near, Carnival was the first to go. Bells replaced drums, sermons replaced song. Still, something had changed forever. The people had discovered that faith and folly were twins, that both, in their way, could reveal truth. By the 15th century, the travelling wagons had grown ornate, their scripts written in rhyme, their masks polished with years of sweat. Yet the essence remained the same, to remind a weary world that righteousness and absurdity often wore the same face. At sunset, when the play was done, the players packed their props, the wooden cross, the devil's tail, the fake coins of greed. The crowd dispersed, still chuckling, still thoughtful, and for one evening, in that flicker of shared breath, the boundary between heaven and earth had thinned. Tomorrow they would return to their fields, their guilds, their laws. But tonight, they had looked at the world and seen it as it truly was. Tragic, comic, beautiful, foolish, and somehow still worth living in. And as the last wagon rolled away into the dark, one child's laughter lingered longest, high, pure, echoing across the cobblestones like a bell that had forgotten it, once tolled only for fear. The Middle Ages were built on faith, stone by stone, prayer by prayer. But by its later centuries, another kind of cathedral began to rise, invisible, made not of mortar but of thought, and those who dared to build it risked everything. Books were not merely objects then, they were miracles. A single manuscript could take years to make. Monks hunched over desks by candlelight, quills scratching in rhythm with prayer, ink staining fingertips blue. Each page was both devotion and defiance of darkness. The script itself was a kind of breath curves of Latin shaped like miniature prayers. But as towns grew, parchment escaped the cloister. Merchants learned to count. Lawyers learned to read. Scholars began to question what had once been unquestionable. Knowledge, like fire, leapt from one mind to another, and soon the church, that eternal guardian of order, felt its walls tremble. Imagine a scribe in Paris, late at night, copying a forbidden text. His candle burns low, his hand trembles. The book before him is not scripture, but Aristotle, newly translated from Arabic, banned in many regions. He copies anyway. To him, the words are not heresy but wonder, that the world might be understood not only through faith but through reason. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame toll midnight. He dips his pen again, whispering, "God made intellect. Why then should its use offend him?" This was the heart of the tension that would define the late Middle Ages. Can one seek truth without disobeying God? The Church answered, often with fire. Universities, once safe havens of theology, became battlegrounds. Oxford, Bologna, Paris all hummed with argument. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile heaven and logic, insisting that reason was merely faith made visible. But others went further. William of Ockham questioned papal authority. Roger Bacon studied optics, alchemy, and the nature of light itself, claiming that experiment was a path to the divine. The line between devotion and danger blurred. To read too widely was to risk suspicion. To question scripture was to flirt with damnation. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, grew longer each year, though it could never keep pace with curiosity. For every heretic burned, another reader appeared in the ashes. And then came the great unbinding, the printing press. In 1440, in a quiet German workshop, Johannes Gutenberg began what no emperor or pope could undo. He harnessed metal, oil, and pressure to give birth to multiplication, to the idea that words could exist beyond walls. The first printed Bibles looked like miracles themselves, crisp, beautiful, perfect as angelic speech. The Church praised them at first, but within a generation, the same presses were printing ideas that defied it. Tracts, satires, manifestos. Knowledge had slipped its leash. The effect was slow, then sudden. In monasteries, scribes found themselves replaced by machines. In taverns, men argued over pamphlets they could barely read. In courts, new laws tried to tame the flood, but paper travels faster than parchment, and thought faster still. One chronicler wrote in despair, "It is as if words have grown wings of lead, too heavy to burn, yet too swift to catch." Censorship became both art and terror. Inquisitors combed markets for illicit books, burning them by cartload. Yet printers learned to hide subversive texts between pages of prayer, binding rebellion inside devotion. To open such a book was to play a dangerous game, not knowing whether one would find salvation or sedition. Still, ideas are like seeds. Once planted, they germinate in silence. By the late 15th century, a new kind of believer had appeared, one who prayed with lips but questioned with eyes. They read the world itself as scripture, the flight of birds, the anatomy of plants, the movement of stars. The age of experiment was dawning inside the age of obedience. But for many, the price of knowledge was still blood. In Florence, a young artist sketched bodies in secret, dissecting corpses by night to learn what God had hidden under skin. He feared the Inquisition, but he feared ignorance more. His name would later echo through centuries. Leonardo. Elsewhere, midwives were accused of witchcraft for knowing herbs that healed too well. Scholars who mapped the heavens were warned that their charts trespassed on divine territory. To measure creation, a bishop warned, is to think oneself its maker, yet the thirst grew unstoppable. Manuscripts multiplied, crossing borders like exiles. Margins filled with heretical questions. If the earth moves, does heaven move too? If man can know nature, what need of miracle? Even the common folk, though illiterate, felt the shift. Tales once told by priests now passed from mouth to mouth in taverns, recast as stories of brave thinkers defying tyrants. Knowledge had become myth, dangerous, magnetic, alive. Still, for every bold voice, there was silence. Many thinkers recanted under threat, others vanished into prisons or pyres. But the world had already changed. The written word had learned to multiply, and multiplication is a kind of immortality. The church would endure, but never again would it be the sole keeper of truth. The book, once chained to the altar, now belonged to the streets. And so, the same ink that once copied gospels now wrote revolutions. A peasant who could not read might still hold a printed page and feel its power, as if the letters themselves carried light, the sight of it dense, black, endless whispered of a world wider than any sermon. From that whisper would come the Renaissance, the Reformation, the modern age. But in this moment, at the twilight of the Middle Ages, it was still fragile, still forbidden, still holy in its own way. A monk in a dying scriptorium looks up from his last parchment and listens to the faint clatter of a press far away. He does not hate it. He understands. The sound is not rebellion, but continuity. A new way to copy what was once divine. The human desire to know. He dips his pen again and writes one final line before the candle gutters. Truth, like fire, is not evil for burning. And with that, the Middle Ages begin to end. Not with a war, nor a king's decree, but with a whisper of ink and the quiet turning of a printed page. By the late 15th century, the old world stood trembling, half in shadow, half in light. The towers, laws and rituals that had once defined the medieval soul were still standing, but something had begun to hum beneath them, like a new current beneath ice. 1,000 small rebellions in fabric, in fasting, in laughter, in ink, had gathered into one long murmur. What if the world could be different? The strange laws that once ruled every breath, when to eat, what to wear, how to pray, when to sleep, who to obey, had not disappeared, but their certainty had. The world no longer fit inside its own commandments. Imagine, for a moment, a single town, any town, somewhere in Europe near the year 1500. The church bell still rings at dawn, calling the faithful to prayer, but fewer kneel than before. In the market, a baker weighs his loaves with practiced care, but he also keeps a hidden stash of printed leaflets under the counter, words that question the fairness of rent or the silence of priests. The tailor still measures cloth by the rules of the guild, but he whispers that new dyes from the east make colours no law has named. And in the square, a painter sketches the faces of peasants not as sinners, not as saints, but as people. Their eyes are tired, yes, but they shine with something the church never taught and the nobility never owned: awareness. This was the quiet miracle of the century. Not wealth, not conquest, but awakening. After centuries of being told who they were, people had begun to look inward and ask, who am I, if not what law allows me to be? The world did not answer in words, but in change. The forests once reserved for kings were being cleared for farms. The serf, once bound to soil, now walked toward towns to sell his labour. The plague had left its scar, but also its lesson, that the powerful were as mortal as the rest. And in monasteries where chants once filled the air, young novices now studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, as if numbers and stars could reveal as much of God as Scripture. Even the heavens themselves were beginning to shift. In a tower in Poland, a quiet scholar named Copernicus stared at the night sky and saw what no law could forbid, that the earth might not be the centre of all things. He said nothing, yet the thought itself was treason against 1,000 years of certainty. The Middle Ages were ending, but not in a single hour. They unravelled slowly, thread by thread, each rule that broke revealing another truth beneath it. Sumptuary laws faded as merchants grew richer than knights. Curfews softened when lanterns lit the streets. Guilds fractured as trade reached beyond cities to oceans. The ordeal by fire became the trial by reason. And even the bell, that ancient heartbeat of order, now measured not devotion but time, mechanical, exact, and endless. The world had entered its twilight of obedience. Yet not all mourned. For peasants and craftsmen, freedom was not frightening, it was intoxicating. They began to read, to travel, to dream. They built ships that would soon cross oceans and presses that would cross boundaries of belief. The same Europe that had once forbidden curiosity now found itself driven by it. Still, for every light, a shadow remained. The old fears did not die, they changed form. The witch trials would soon begin, replacing medieval superstition with early modern hysteria. The Inquisition's fires still glowed, fueled by the same hunger for control that had once banned bright clothes or laughter on the Sabbath. Progress, it seemed, still wore chains, but the chain links had weakened. People had tasted selfhood. They had glimpsed the idea that law, like flesh, could age, and that obedience was only as sacred as the justice behind it. The painter finishes his sketch in the square. A merchant's daughter leans forward to see her likeness unidealized, honest, alive. She laughs. For the first time, laughter itself no longer feels like sin. Across the square, a priest preaches against vanity and pride, his voice echoing off the stones. But few stop to listen. A group of boys chase each other through the fountain, splashing water once thought holy but now simply cool and real. A mother calls them back. The air smells of bread, ink, and rain. Above it all, the bell rings as it always has. But now, its sound no longer commands. It reminds. It reminds the town of what was lost and what survived. The rhythm of human life, stubborn and imperfect, still beating beneath the ruins of order. And somewhere, beyond the town, beyond the forest, beyond even the horizon, a new age is stirring. Renaissance, Reformation, reason names that have not yet been spoken, but whose breath is already in the wind. The medieval world does not vanish. It settles, like sediment in the river of history, shaping everything that flows above it. Its strange laws, its fears, its miracles all remain, half buried but eternal, waiting for rediscovery. Because history never ends, it only exhales. And if you listen closely, even now, beneath the hum of modern life, you can still hear that ancient bell tolling not as command, but as memory. It rings for every law that tried to contain the human spirit, for every hand that stitched defiance into a sleeve, for every laugh whispered behind curfew, for every word copied in candlelight against decree. It rings, softly, for all who lived by rules they did not write, and for the quiet, eternal rebellion of those who dreamed beyond them. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's tempting to see only the darkness, the chains of law, the smell of smoke, the silence of obedience. But history, like stained glass, glows most beautifully when light passes through its flaws. Those strange, rigid rules, the ones that once dictated what to wear, when to eat, how to pray, even when to breathe, did not vanish without leaving traces. They shaped the world that followed in ways both subtle and profound. Every law, however cruel or absurd, began as an attempt to hold chaos at bay. And though the centuries transformed their forms, the instincts behind them never really disappeared. Take fashion, for instance. The medieval sumptuary laws, those fabric-bound hierarchies that separated silk from wool, royalty from poverty, taught Europe a language of clothing that never fully faded. Even now, centuries later, fabric still whispers status. The velvet cloak has become the tailored suit, the noble's crest, the designer logo. The old rule remains, softer but familiar. Wear your power where others can see it. The same is true of food. The Church's fasting laws, which once filled calendars with days of abstinence, left behind the rhythm of modern diet and ritual, from meatless Fridays to the feasts that mark the turning of seasons. Even our holidays echo those old edicts. Times to restrain, times to indulge. We inherited the pattern, if not the fear. The curfew bell that once darkened towns now lives on in subtler sounds, streetlights flickering on, sirens warning of storms, phone screens dimming at midnight. Order still speaks, only in new tones. And the guilds, those stern brotherhoods of craft and commerce, built the bones of modern labour itself. Their oaths became contracts, their apprenticeships became education, their mastery became professionalism. What they began in secrecy and ritual, we now call industry. Even the Church's trials, those brutal tests of ordeal and confession, planted an unintended seed, the hunger for fairness. When fire and drowning proved unjust, Europe sought another judge reason. From that need for justice came the roots of our legal systems, our juries, our presumption of innocence. The absurd gave birth to the rational. Yet the most lasting inheritance of all was not a law, but a habit of mind, obedience woven with doubt. Medieval people lived in a world of boundaries. but they also learned to find life between them. A peasant who hid a roast rabbit from the Lord's eye, a monk who read a forbidden text, a woman who mixed herbs though priests called it witchcraft. All of them carried the same small rebellion, survival through defiance. That quiet instinct to endure rules without entirely obeying them became the foundation of modern individuality. The Middle Ages, for all their control, accidentally taught humanity how to resist control. They gave us the theatre of hypocrisy. Yes, kings pretending piety, priests preaching poverty from golden pulpits, but they also gave us laughter as armour. The carnivals, the feasts, the mocking songs of peasants who knew the system was absurd yet lived joyfully inside it. Humour became a weapon sharper than any sword. And faith, though wounded, endured. The same faith that had once bound men in fear also taught them to hope. The cathedrals that rose from centuries of toil still stand not as monuments of oppression, but of devotion. Their spires point upward not to authority, but to aspiration. If the medieval world was a cage, it was one built with dreams. Every rule that constrained the body left space for imagination to grow. Every forbidden act inspired stories, songs and myths that survive long after the kings and bishops who wrote the laws turned to dust. In that sense, the Middle Ages never truly ended. They live in our cities and our habits, in the way we queue, the way we whisper, the way we look for permission to break the rules we quietly know are wrong. They live in the clash between order and curiosity that still defines our species. And perhaps that's the truest legacy, that we are descendants, not of the rebels or the rulers alone, but of both. The tension between obedience and defiance is our inheritance. It hums in every heart that wonders if tradition and progress can ever truly coexist. So, the next time you hear a bell toll in the distance, think of them, the men and women who once lived by its sound, the peasants who froze by law, the priests who feared laughter, the weavers fined for a forbidden colour. Think of how much the world had to break before it could become ours. And if you ever find yourself longing for simpler times, for the certainty of old rules, the clarity of hierarchy, remember the cost of that comfort. Silence, superstition, and fear disguised as order. The Middle Ages were many things: brutal, beautiful, ignorant, ingenious, but above all, they were human. 1,000 years of contradictions stitched together by faith, necessity, and imagination. The rules were strange, yes, but the people who lived under them were not. They loved, they laughed, they dreamed, and in doing so, they carried us forward. And as the last echoes of that age fade into memory, one truth remains: soft, but unbroken. Every generation lives by rules it thinks eternal. Every age believes itself the end of history. But time, patient and merciless, always turns those certainties into curiosities. The Middle Ages ended the way all eras do, quietly, invisibly, as the next one began to breathe. And so the bell tolls one last time, not for control but for memory, a sound that says, in its slow, ancient rhythm, we were here, we obeyed, we wondered, we endured.